How does an economist look at something really complex, say the volatile price of fuel in Nigeria, or maybe the housing crisis in America, and not just feel completely overwhelmed? I mean, the sheer volume of choices people make every second. It seems impossible to predict anything in a world that messy.
It really does feel that way sometimes, but that feeling, that impossibility, that's kind of what the economist's toolkit is designed to cut through. They aren't trying to track every single person's decision, you know?
Right.
Instead, they use this highly structured thinking process. It lets them move from just one observation, maybe a shift in an inflation index, all the way to predicting, potentially, a country's future or suggesting policy.
And that structure, that thinking process, is what we want to drill into today.
Yeah.
Our mission really is to take you, the listener, behind the curtain.
Yeah.
Help you master that basic way of thinking. You're going to unpack the 3 essential tools economists use to analyze things. Could be anything from why tomatoes suddenly cost more to these huge multi-billion-dollar government decisions. Okay, let's unpack this.
Right. So every journey, you could say, starts with just noticing something, an observation. But in economics, that observation very quickly needs to be quantified. It turns into data.
Okay. Like you walk into the market and the bread you always buy, it's suddenly weigh 100 instead of 800. That's the observation. Simple enough.
Exactly.
But the economist's immediate next step, that intellectual leap, is to demand, numbers. Objective evidence to answer the big question, why? Why did that price change?
That's the absolutely crucial distinction, isn't it? Your personal observation, that's anecdotal. Data, though, that's the objective evidence you need to actually move the analysis forward.
Okay.
We need numbers that tell us if the cost went up because of global stuff, like wheat prices rising everywhere, or maybe local things like higher transport costs because fuel is scarce again. Data tells us what happened to the price.
But it doesn't tell us the why.
Not yet. That comes next.
And getting that data, that's a huge job, right? It's not just looking things up online. It's institutional.
Absolutely. Listeners should recognize this. When analysts talk about inflation in the West, they're almost always citing the Consumer Price Index, the CPI.
Yeah.
And that's this meticulously constructed basket of goods tracked constantly.
Right.
Similarly, in Nigeria, you have the National Bureau of Statistics, the NBS. They're putting out monthly reports tracking everything from employment to price shifts for specific things people buy.
So the data collection has rigor. That's the foundation we can trust.
We can trust the starting point, yes. But the real skill, the analysis, is turning those raw numbers, the difference between 800 and 1200 for bread, into actual economic knowledge. Meaningful insight.
Okay, but those reports, the data, they're like snapshots, right? A picture in time. They don't really tell you the whole story, the direction things are heading.
That's true.
So to predict, or even to suggest a solution, you need something more dynamic. And I guess this brings us to the second pillar.
Yeah.
The economic model.
Precisely. The model, think of it as the economist's simplified map of reality.
A map.
The real world is just incredibly noisy. There's emotion, politics, weather, a million things happening. A model deliberately ignores most of that noise.
To focus on.
To focus intensely on what it sees as the key relationships. It won't show you every tiny street and alley, but it's designed to get you from point A to point B successfully.
So we're talking about those fundamental frameworks,
Yep.
like the basic rule. When supply of something falls and demand stays the same, prices go up. That kind of core idea.
That's the absolute backbone of basic market analysis, yes. And we see it play out constantly in really everyday situations.
Give us an example.
Okay, think about tomatoes. In a Lagos market, maybe. If the rainy season is really bad, crops get damaged, that immediately reduces the number of good tomatoes available. Supply is low.
So people still want to make stew. Demand hasn't changed much.
Exactly. Demand stays pretty consistent, so the simple model predicts correctly that prices will shoot up.
Or, flip side, maybe in the US market, a new drilling technique suddenly boosts oil production, increases supply dramatically. If demand for gas doesn't change much right away, the model says the price at the pump should fall. All else being equal, of course.
All else being equal, that's key. And to visualize this, economists rely on those fundamental graphs you probably remember from school, the demand curve and the supply curve.
Right, demand slopes down.
Because people generally want to buy more of something when it's cheaper.
And supply slopes up.
Because producers, sellers, they're usually willing to make and sell more when the price is higher. more profit potential.
Okay, and where those two lines cross on the graph, that's the sweet spot.
That's what we call equilibrium. It represents the market clearing price. The point where the amount buyers want to buy perfectly matches the amount sellers want to sell.
We don't need to get lost in the geometry, but the idea is powerful. It implies that any shock, like a sudden new import tax or a pandemic hitting it, shifts those entire curves.
It does, and that creates a new equilibrium point, which can often be painful for someone. Prices change, quantities change.
But you mentioned all else being equal. That sounds like a big caveat.
It is, and this is where we have to inject a really critical warning, one that often gets glossed over. The model's greatest strength, its simplicity, its ability to isolate one relationship, is also its biggest weakness.
How so?
Because it deliberately assumes away all that real-world complexity. Human stuff like fear or market panic or sudden government policy shifts that nobody saw coming, those things can break the model's predictions. It's incredibly useful, but it's definitely not gospel truth.
Okay, I follow the logic of the model's supply-demand equilibrium. But to make it work, to draw those curves and predict shifts accurately, economists have to consciously ignore a huge amount of what's actually going on.
Did you?
How do they justify that intellectual shortcut? This must bring us to the third tool, the role of assumptions.
Assumptions, exactly. They are the necessary intellectual scaffolding. Think of them as simple hypothetical conditions that are imposed just to make a ridiculously complex problem manageable enough to actually study.
Scaffolding.
Yeah. Without assumptions, you just can't isolate the effect of one single factor changing. Everything is moving at once.
And the two big ones you always hear about are, first, that people act rationally, which, let's be honest, feels like a huge leap of faith sometimes. I mean, I know I should act rationally when budgeting, but I still bought that fancy espresso machine I didn't really need.
Right. And that's why it's a simplified assumption. Rationality in the model usually just means people generally try to do what's best for themselves, given the information they have. They pursue their self-interest in a predictable way.
Okay, simplified rationality. What's the other big one?
The second, and maybe even more vital assumption, often comes up as a Latin phrase, ceteris paribus.
Ceteris paribus. Sounds fancy.
It just means other factors remain constant.
So, to make a prediction, economists are basically saying, okay, let's pretend everything else in the world stays exactly the same for a minute.
Precisely. That's exactly it. Ceteris paribus allows them to do that. These assumptions aren't about pretending the world is simple or perfect. They're tools to allow the economists to focus their thinking, their logic, on just one variable at a time.
Can you give us the classic example? How does ceteris paribus work when analyzing, say, a price change?
Sure. Take the statement, a rise in the price of beef leads to people buying less beef. Simple enough, right?
Seems logical.
But that analysis relies entirely on ceteris paribus. We are assuming that the buyer's income didn't suddenly double that week. We're assuming their taste for beef didn't mysteriously disappear overnight. We're assuming the price of chicken, the substitute good, didn't also shoot up at the same time.
Got it. You hold everything else steady in your mind just to see the impact of the one thing you're interested in, the price of beef changing.
Exactly. We assume all those other factors are constant, so we can clearly measure the effect of just the price change on how much beef people want to buy. It's purely a mechanism for analytical clarity.
That makes the whole process incredibly efficient. I can see that. So the goal isn't to create a perfect mirror image of reality, which is impossible anyway.
Right.
It's more about using these simplified concepts, these models, supported by these careful assumptions and logic, to make sensible predictions and understand cause and effect in a world that's inherently complex and messy.
That's the synthesis. That's the whole toolkit in action. You move from observing the data to interpreting it using a simple model and then applying rigorous assumption-based logic to understand it.
Okay, this is clicking. Let's spend a bit of time now applying this full toolkit step by step. Walk us through a real-world scenario. You mentioned cooking gas prices in Nigeria earlier. That seems like a good one. How would we analyze that sharp rise?
Great example. Okay, step one, observation and data. We start there. Official reports, news articles, maybe NBS data, all show that the price of LPG cooking gas has doubled, maybe more, in many parts of Nigeria over the past year or so. That's our fact, our empirical starting point.
Okay, data point established. Price is way up. Step two, apply the model, the basic supply and demand model. Why did the price jump?
The model immediately points us to either a big jump in demand or a sharp drop in supply, or maybe some combination.
And in this case, demand for cooking gas probably hasn't doubled, right? People still need to cook, about the same amount.
Exactly. Demand is likely pretty steady, maybe even growing slowly, but not enough to explain a doubling of price. So the model strongly suggests the root cause must be on the supply side. A sharp contraction, a decrease in supply.
Okay, so supply dropped. Why?
Well, digging deeper, our sources, news reports, industry analysis pointed to a couple of key things. A big one was increased global prices for LPG, making imports much more expensive, combined with things like high local taxes, maybe logistical issues, and importantly, not enough local production to cushion the blow.
So multiple factors squeezing supply.
Right. The overall effect is that the supply curve in our model shifted inwards to the left. And when supply shrinks like that and demand stays put, the equilibrium price has to go up, often way up.
Okay, makes sense. Data showed the price rise. The model pointed to shrinking supply. Now, step 3, reasoning and policy formulation. If the model shows the supply constraint is the main driver, what does logic tell us about solutions?
The logical policy response based on that model is to find ways to boost supply, to shift that supply curve back outwards to the right.
Yeah.
Well, the government could look at removing import duties on LPG, making it cheaper to bring in. Or they could offer incentives, maybe tax breaks, to encourage more local production capacity. Either of those should, in theory, increase supply and help bring the price down.
Removing the import duty sounds like a relatively quick fix. Seems like it would help millions of households almost immediately.
It could.
But hang on, this is where the critical thinking comes in, right? What's the trade-off? That import duty, it was bringing money into the government's budget.
Ah, yes.
Doesn't the simple supply-demand model kind of ignore the fiscal hole you just created by removing the tax? That money has to come from somewhere else, maybe more debt, maybe taxes on something else.
That's an absolutely excellent challenge, and it perfectly demonstrates the limits of the basic supply and demand model. A good economist knows they can't stop there. They must incorporate that trade-off.
So the analysis gets broader.
It has to. While the immediate sort of microeconomic goal is stabilizing the cooking gas price for consumers, improving their welfare, there's a macroeconomic reality. Government budgets aren't infinite.
Right.
So the analysis has to move from just asking what lowers the price to asking what's the most efficient way to boost supply, considering all the costs and benefits. This includes the cost of lost tax revenue.
So it becomes a comparison.
Exactly. The policy choice often involves comparing things like, is the economic and social cost of lost import revenue less damaging than the social cost of millions of households struggling to afford basic cooking fuel? That kind of comprehensive comparison, weighing the trade-offs, that's the final, really essential stage of robust economic thinking.
That deeper analysis, needing to weigh competing goals and trade-offs, that feels like what separates just knowing the tools from actually mastering the toolkit.
Precisely. And this whole analytical process, it's fundamental. It doesn't matter if you're a business owner in ABBA trying to figure out how to price a new product, or, a student in Canada trying to understand why your government is bringing in carbon taxes. These tools, data, models, logical reasoning with assumptions, they enable you to move past just feeling confused.
They help you make smarter, more informed choices based on logic, not just gut feeling.
Exactly. Rooted in logic and evidence.
Okay, so what does this all mean? Let's quickly recap. We've walked through the economist's basic intellectual journey. They start with data, the facts, the numbers, to describe what's actually happening. Then they use a model, like supply and demand, as a simplified map to explain the key relationships driving those facts.
Right, the map.
And they lean heavily on assumptions and logic, things like ceteris paribus, to simplify the complex reality enough to analyze those relationships efficiently and draw conclusions.
It's the framework, the mechanism that brings some structure to what looks like chaos.
Definitely. Now, we spent today focusing mostly on specific goods: bread, tomatoes, cooking gas. These feel like very immediate, localized, what economists call micro issues.
Yes, microeconomics.
So as you, our listener, start integrating this toolkit into your own thinking, here's a final thought to chew on. Why is the price of a single loaf of bread considered a microeconomic issue, focusing on just that one market? But inflation, the overall persistent rise in prices across the entire economy, why is that considered a macroeconomic issue?
Ooh, good question. Scale matters.
What really stands out to you in that distinction between micro and macro? And why does the sheer scale of a problem like economy-wide inflation require different kinds of models, maybe different assumptions to understand and solve? Something to mull over until our next deep dive.